George Lucas is the greatest con man in the history of cinema.
Ted, I got your voucher.
Out! In our last video, we covered how filmmakers borrow from each other as well as things outside of films, such as art and literature. Here, we see the greatest example of that. The original Star Wars is a film that transformed an entire industry. It's a phenomenal film that stands the test of time as the special effects work and world building in the film continued to capture the minds of young and old moviegoers. The first film spawned a trilogy: books, games, another trilogy, shows, another trilogy, spin-offs, more games, merchandising.
Where the real money from the movie is made.
It is all thanks to George Lucas and his singular vision for creating this incredible world, carrying that genius mind into every aspect of his creative process. Okay, maybe not. Lucas had the great initial ideas and assembled a tremendous team around him, much like any great director. Through the process, there were moments where the film could have been completely different or even ruined.
The dialogue was a little bit difficult. I remember there was one line that I just begged him to take out. But we can't turn back. Fear is their greatest defense. I doubt if the actual security there is any greater than it was on Aquilai or Soas. And what there is most likely directed towards a large-scale assault. And I thought, who talks like this, George?
Particularly, Star Wars went through a great many drafts and revisions on the cutting room floor until the final cut had a ton of energy and cut out a lot of unnecessary filler.
He wound up grounding me for the rest of the season. You should have been there. It was fantastic. You gotta take it a little easy, Luke.
Since then, much has been said about the influences that made Star Wars what it became, including from Lucas himself. Much like how we talked about in our previous video, directors have that singular vision for what they want in their film. With that vision, you have things that have influenced that vision or that you are borrowing from to enhance or add context to that vision. Star Wars in particular is a film that draws from so much, not just with media, but even historical context and real-world issues that contributed to the overall world building. Today, we break that all down. Plus, we talk about the many films and directors that took Star Wars further or were greatly influenced by it.
The good guys are the rebels. They're using asymmetric warfare against a highly organized empire. I think we call those guys terrorists today. We call them Mujahideen, we call them Al-Qaeda.
When I did it, they were Viet Cong.
In order to understand Lucas's intentions and what his meaning was behind Star Wars, we have to understand the real-world context, particularly from where he's coming from. He's coming from graduating out of USC in the late 60s, a period that fostered resentment and anti-authoritarian views towards the American government due to the conflicts of the Civil Rights Movement and the Vietnam War. We can see how anti-authoritarianism runs through the film, as the heroic Luke Skywalker and his band of rebels are in direct conflict with the totalitarian empire. The broad stroke is that the Rebel Empire conflict is the Vietnam conflict, with the rebels being the Viet Cong and the Empire being the US. However, there are other details that obscure that one-to-one comparison. The Empire only has officers with English accents, in direct contrast to Mark Hamill, Harrison Ford, and Carrie Fisher with American accents. This is meant to draw comparisons to the American Revolutionary War. On the other hand, you have the ground troops known as the Stormtroopers, which is a direct ripoff of the Nazi Sturmabteilung. The Imperial uniforms also resemble the German officer uniforms during that time. The action sequences have parallels too, with the space battles bearing similarities to World War II dogfights and the ground battles bearing similarities to guerrilla warfare. One can make the conclusion that Lucas specifically approached the material from an anti-authoritarian view, especially as he has said that he made Star Wars as a warning for how democracies can turn dictatorial. This carries into the prequel trilogy, where the political rise of Palpatine is reminiscent of popular and controversial figures such as Julius Caesar and Napoleon Bonaparte. The real-life comparisons don't stop there, as Lucas drew from ancient history as well. We will cover later how the samurai films of the 50s were direct influences for Lucas. However, these influences are not just aesthetic or filmmaking influences. The Jedi are very much the space samurai in Star Wars. From their robes to their sense of nobility, samurai are very much a part of Star Wars. We even see parallels of the Senpai-Kohai system, with Obi-Wan being Luke's senpai. Of course, the Jedi's lightsaber is probably the most obvious homage to the samurai, complete with different Jedi utilizing different stances when dueling. The samurai not the only piece of the Jedi formula. Continuing east, the Jedi mentality and spirituality can be found in monk philosophy, particularly the Jedi's practice of meditation. It is dubious to see this evidence and present George Lucas as some type of fraud or con man for borrowing from real-world events. Art is just a mirror through which artists communicate their feelings on society. Great artists are in constant communication with the outside world, and thus their art registers so truthfully and well. It is in the film comparisons where it starts to get a little tricky, but we'll get to that later.
Young fool, 'tis only now in this thy final living moment thou dost comprehend thy folly and my might.
All modern storytelling draws from some type of literature. Star Wars is no exception. The folklore of King Arthur and general Arthurian mythology is fertile ground for any storyteller to take from, particularly those who work in the adventure genre. It's really fertile ground when you're making your story about a young adventurer who is an orphan, gets trained by a mentor, and has an all-powerful father. You also have major elements from sci-fi author Doc Smith, from the tractor beam to the size of spaceships to even the whole hiding in junk gag. The more intriguing literature to note would be the literature that would inspire films of their own, Tolkien's The Lord of the Rings and Herbert's Dune. We know that initial drafts of the Star Wars script contain dialogue entirely taken from The Hobbit. However, structurally, there are a great many parallels. A couple of good-natured people carrying something important, but there's a terrible superpower that threatens everything. You also have a bunch of evil henchmen with an evil guy controlling them, with an even more evil guy behind him. But at least our hero can learn from a wise old man until he sacrifices himself. With Dune, it's a bit obvious with Tatooine and Arrakis, the young guy leading the charge against an empire, the idea of a chosen one that has an air of magic to him, etc. The Lord of the Rings bit is pretty eye-catchy. The defense is, Star Wars is a story about adventure. There are thematic elements within that genre that carry from the King Arthur folklore. That same folklore has a significant influence on the work of Tolkien, with the quest and having some type of object that is of grand importance. However, King Arthur didn't have to fight Sauron or deal with orcs, nor did he have to fight Vader and his stormtroopers. That's where it gets dicey. Granted, The Hobbit and The Lord of the Rings were very successful books and made Tolkien a legend. I'm sure a bunch of nerds like George Lucas read them and either deliberately ripped from them or subconsciously referenced the literature. Either way, the correlation with Star Wars is significant enough to be notable. Finally, we get to film and TV. Well, there's the first one. Giant credits at the beginning of a Flash Gordon film serial. Oh, look at that, there's Buck Rogers too. This is probably one of the more obvious inspirations, given how blatant it is. The Flash Gordon comics and serials of the late 30s and 40s were a big influence on George Lucas, as he was a big fan of them as a kid. He was such a big fan that he even tried to make a Flash Gordon movie in the 70s, but couldn't get the rights to it, so he pivoted and made Star Wars. I'd say it worked out for him in the end.
I may have gone too far in a few places.
Aside from the title crawl, you have Ming the Merciless, but it's Emperor Palpatine. You have Flash Gordon and Prince Baron, but it's Luke and Han. Princess Aura meet Princess Leia. Oh, look at that! A big hairy friend. Wonder who that could be. There are further comparisons in the later films, like the Goko versus the Rancor. They also had ray guns and dogfighting spaceships, but that's a broader sci-fi influence than a real specific one. As we get further into these influences, it appears that Lucas really took all these elements and created an amalgamation of sorts that became Star Wars. You take a little of this, a little of that, and so on. The question is, to what end do these inspirations become rips or just plain copying? Have you ever seen Metropolis? Well, there's C-3PO. We know that Lucas was a fan of epics like The Searchers and Lawrence of Arabia. Those films were more inspirations of style rather than story. You see that in his composition, how Lucas shot the desert. Delving into the other movies for a second, the Yoda death is a ripoff of the death scene in Lost Horizon. The real weird one would have to be the pivotal battle on the Death Star. The fighters charge the Death Star and have to go through a canyon, trying to reach the end so that they could drop a bomb, all while being fired at by turrets. Hey, wait a minute! Oh, come on, this is getting out of hand now. Mosquito Squadron and 633 Squadron in particular stand out as pretty clear inspirations for the fighter scene. Mosquito Squadron less so, given that it's not really a trench. Plus, people know how bombers work. If anything, the inspiration is just World War II and the strategies employed there. But it's tough to not see those Death Star turrets when you're watching 633 Squadron. What does this all say about Star Wars? Is it a valid film? Well, it is. It's out there. It's been out there for more than 40 years now. You can't just send it back or something. But is it authentic? Is it something that should be celebrated? It's one thing to pay homage to a moment, recontextualize something for a new audience, or just borrow from someone's style. It's another thing where Star Wars has elements in it that is taken from media that's around 10 years younger than when it came out. One of the more obvious examples of a remake is Sergio Leone's A Fistful of Dollars, remaking Akira Kurosawa's Yojimbo. Leone borrows both style and story structure, complete with a semi-silent protagonist who comes into town and takes on two rival gangs while pitting them against each other. This led to a lawsuit from the production company Toho, leading to Leone settling out of court. So, there are real ramifications for this stuff. You can't just make your own Ratatouille movie by calling it Ratatouille or something.
Precisely!
Now, that's the most blatant example, given just how many elements Leone took from Kurosawa. Can the filmmakers of 633 Squadron argue their case against Star Wars? Only for that one sequence. Frank Capra for Lost Horizon only has that Yoda scene to raise a fuss about. Whether intentional or not, Lucas was able to take from a variety of material and layer it on one another where you can't make such a definitive case, unlike with A Fistful of Dollars. If Tatooine had magic sand that gave Luke the Force, Frank Herbert would have a real case on his hand. Same thing that if, instead of lightsabers, Luke used a metal sword like in The Lord of the Rings. But because the material is all interwoven together, you can't really nail it down. A feature of postmodern art is that you are building on the works of modern as well as past artists. This understanding often lends postmodern art to becoming a pastiche of the past. Look at Quentin Tarantino's filmography, for example. A little Brian De Palma here, a little Sergio Leone here, throw in some blaxploitation films, and you get some of his style. With Star Wars, it's no different. However, it can't be overstated how Star Wars would not have been what it was if not for one director in particular. Lucas may have borrowed from many, but none come close to the legend, Akira Kurosawa.
Kurosawa's a true genius of Kurosawa.
Yeah. And you have to do what Kurosawa used to say is, it has to have immaculate reality.
Yeah.
Someone once asked Mr. Kurosawa if his movies have a common theme. His answer was that they ask a common question. Why can't people be happier together?
You're not going to find really a lot of filmmakers that have the facile quality with the medium that Kurosawa had.
Kurosawa is regarded as the most celebrated filmmaker to ever come out of Japan. While his contemporaries in post-war Japan moved away from Western filmmaking techniques and styles, Akira Kurosawa was a nut for Westerns and saw the folklore of the samurai as the Japanese equivalent to the cowboy. Thus, he created a wonderful library of samurai films, rich with cinematic depth and flavor that are still celebrated and talked about today. He did make great films set in modern times, like Ikiru and High and Low. However, those samurai films from the 50s to the 80s are what his legacy is truly made of. Seven Samurai, Rashomon, Yojimbo, Throne of Blood, Ran, Kagemusha, etc. One film that's particularly noteworthy is The Hidden Fortress from 1958. Here, you have two weaker characters to provide comic relief and characters through which the story is introduced. Plus, you have a princess with a bounty on her head, who also is a secret badass. I don't know, man, George is really starting to look suspicious here. The real thing to note here is how much Kurosawa meant to Lucas. He would not have had his visual eye without those films he saw in USC. The usage of zoom lenses, the wide shots, and how Kurosawa used perspective to present his action. All of these are qualities that shape Star Wars and the greater Star Wars universe. The fake princess being killed very much mirrors how Padme's handmaiden gets killed as a decoy. Seven Samurai inspired a Mandalorian episode and a Clone Wars episode. Hell, the Mandalorian is basically the man with no name / Sanjuro. The samurai, the Jedi, they all fight for honor and keeping the peace. The environment plays very much into the combat in a lot of Star Wars, much like the great battles in Seven Samurai and others. Also, it's pretty cool that George got to do the whole hand getting chopped off scene like with Yojimbo. Akira Kurosawa is entirely separate from the others, however. It really needs to be understood how much his work meant to George Lucas. As Lucas rose in power and skill, Kurosawa began to make less and less films as his life began to dwindle. Lucas and Steven Spielberg were the forerunners in making sure his life and legacy were honored, as they even helped Kurosawa produce one of his final films, Dreams, in 1990. Perhaps this is the greatest example of homage in filmmaking. The young filmmaker took the style of the old, made it his own, and still correctly honored the work of the past. It's a touching thing given how generations and culture separates these two individuals, yet the power of film made them a pseudo master and student pairing. With Kurosawa's passing, it was just the student left to become the master. Thus, we reach the point where Lucas is the master, and to see just how many people he influenced.
And the thing that got me, that grabbed me, was that feeling of a new, young character. And in the case of this conversation, it was a female character. Didn't know anything about her. But in the conversation, that question of this young woman asking, who is Luke Skywalker? I don't know why, but it made me feel like, that's so cool. That idea that there would be a discovery. These would be, essentially kids who didn't see Star Wars themselves in this movie, who would be in this universe.
While J.J. Abrams is probably the biggest Spielberg fan of the more modern filmmakers, it has to be noted how J.J. obviously borrowed from the original Star Wars for his sequel films. The comparisons got to the point where there were accusations that The Force Awakens was just a blatant copy of A New Hope.
I think everybody at this point is saying it's A New Hope, it's just like A New Hope, and it is in a lot of ways, but like Star Wars, like people have kind of deified Star Wars and made it into this as if it's some like big complex story, which it never really has been. It's fun space adventures with likable characters.
Rian Johnson, of course, is another current filmmaker who got a crack at Star Wars. With Rian, however, it's important to note that he also borrowed from Akira Kurosawa. In The Last Jedi, Ben Solo has that pivotal moment that is remembered in a variety of ways throughout the film. It's the Rashomon effect, from the film Rashomon.
Come on, Homer, Japan will be fun. You like Rashomon?
That's not how I remember it.
Roland Emmerich enrolled in film school after seeing Star Wars. It's no surprise that when he made Independence Day, he beckoned Star Wars for inspiration. A bunch of fighters trying to take down a big spaceship that's gonna kill everyone, only for a small vessel to finally take it down? Yeah, sounds about right.
Welcome to Earth.
Peter Quill in Guardians of the Galaxy tends to borrow a lot from Luke and Han, given that he's got some magic in him, but he's also a space scoundrel. Groot is basically plant-based Chewbacca. In a way, the concept of the Force was used in the anime film Akira, especially with how the Force interconnected everything together. Akira just took it to the extreme. Then you have all the crappy spin-offs, don't need to talk about them. You also have Spaceballs and the Family Guy Star Wars movies, all of which hold a special place in our hearts.
You hear that? Sounds like we're being boarded from the rear. And not the hey, take a deep breath, let's experiment kind of boarded from the rear.
The weird one to talk about is Star Trek, oddly enough. Star Trek the motion picture came out a few years after Star Wars, just as the sci-fi genre moved into action-adventure rather than space exploration like 2001: A Space Odyssey or Close Encounters of the Third Kind. The motion picture borrowed more from Close Encounters, presenting slower action and conflicts involving character dialogue rather than actual physical conflict. Those original Trek films, however, began to morph into more adventures. Wrath of Khan was about their version of Darth Vader, basically. Sure, they were doing adventures in the original Star Trek, so it's a bit of a stretch. However, once you get to 2009 Trek, it's all Star Wars. Oh hey JJ! It's the build-up to the big space battle, including some type of hand-to-hand combat or maybe a big conflict with the main bad guy. It's Marvel, but Star Trek, but also Star Wars? There's a question for you. Was the MCU inspired by Star Wars? Yes. You don't get the Avengers movies, Thor, and all those without Star Wars. The originator of the superhero movie is Superman, of course. Everything leverages on that superhero origin story template working, as it worked for Batman in 1989 and Spider-Man in 2002. However, the big battle movies like Avengers Endgame or Captain America Civil War borrow liberally from Star Wars. The comedy mixed with the fantasy elements of larger-than-life heroes battling villains while also using their special powers to defeat them. Of course, the comics came before Star Wars. The character Thor is not ripping off of Luke or anything. However, the presentation of our present day being infused with fantastical machinery, beasts outside of Earth, and powerful beings waging war on each other kind of comes from Star Wars. Hell, what is Infinity War if not a much grander interpretation of Star Wars? It's especially true with Return of the Jedi. There's the ground battle, the bombing raid on the Death Star, and Luke versus Vader. In Infinity War, Iron Man and his crew are doing their thing, then Wakanda is trying to fend off Thanos' goons, and then Thor is trying to get his hammer upgraded in space. Plus, the grander scale of what the MCU and Marvel present is taken from Star Wars. Star Wars became a trilogy, then a media conglomerate, and then a worldwide obsession. The MCU adopted that philosophy with their marketing and approach to producing films. Now that they're under the same Disney umbrella, they're practically the same. Release some TV shows, old characters you like, a film or two every year, and wait for the money.
I said all I wanted to do was tell a story of what happened. You know, it started here and it went there, and it's all about generations, and it's about, you know, the issues of fathers and sons and grandfathers, and it's a family soap opera.
Speaking of money, George absolutely cashed out. I bet that Disney deal was so sweet for him, as it should. Who else could envision such a world and capture the minds of multiple generations of people? Many of his contemporaries like Martin Scorsese, Francis Ford Coppola, or Brian De Palma were never able to maximize their efforts from just one film. Really, only Steven Spielberg has been able to stretch out something like Indiana Jones into multiple generations, and even that one is partially due to George Lucas's involvement. Were the prequels bad? Yes and no. While that's a whole other video, it's important to grasp that Lucas made basically the biggest indie films of all time. They were all produced by Lucasfilm and the public ate them all up. Written and directed by George, they are his vision. As much as a lot of those choices were misguided, it's something incredibly unique to see where a $150 million movie is entrusted to basically one guy. That doesn't happen, and he should be celebrated for it. Should he be celebrated for all the films he borrowed from? Well, it's tough. We want our filmmakers to envision a new world. We want them to bring their unique experiences and vision to the big screen for us to enjoy. We want to see the human experience through their eyes. Undoubtedly, we are all connected on this great planet of ours. On that planet, people make art that inspires others. To what end must that inspiration be cut off for filmmakers? Can we not have jump scares because of Friday the 13th? What about teleportation because of Star Trek? Sure, you can't just reskin a sequence and call it your own. There's nuance to these things. George is a master of repackaging all those inspirations into a lightsaber-wielding Jedi. Does that make it okay, or is that lazy? It's a debate that we have here at 305 still. I, for one, think it can get very limiting for directors if we start cutting off what they can borrow and what they can't. Those sequences from 633 Squadron, Lost Horizon, and The Hidden Fortress are pretty substantial and really stand out as being so close to stolen sequences. But I bet you no one thought of them in the theater. I bet you not. That's the magic behind Lucas, and I think that's why Star Wars is still a valid film. Unlike Ratatouille.
Precisely!
Wow, thank you very much for watching this really long video. We hope you enjoyed it and came away with a better understanding of Star Wars and film in general. If you liked it, please like and subscribe. If you didn't, comment below why you hated it. I'm sure we'll respond. Thanks again and have a great day.
You know why I have money and you don't have money?
Okay.
It's because instead of spending my time doing autographs, I spent my time making movies.